Can you describe what you witnessed in the early morning of December 3rd, 2011?
Well, there was a march on December 3rd from our camp at Seattle Central Community College to a warehouse a couple blocks away at 10th and Union. There were bands that were playing and people were really enjoying themselves. People were really excited about the fact that they had a new space to occupy out of the rain and the cold, and everybody seemed to be celebrating the fact that they had successfully occupied the building. Unfortunately, at 3 a.m., police began banging on the doors and demanding entry. Although I have to say that earlier in the evening there was also one arrest at that door, but there seemed to be a shift change for the police, and all those squad cars left, so people were given a sort of false sense of security at that point. But at 3 a.m. the raid began, and as a reporter I was there to observe it. I showed up about 4 o'clock in the morning, so the police activity had been going on for about an hour, and what I witnessed was a fire truck, a ladder truck. When I got there, the ladder was still extended to the top of the building, and they had the entire place cordoned off. So it was very difficult to see what was going on, but it was obvious that people were being arrested inside the building.
What are your feelings about the use of the fire truck in this raid?
I have a question for the Chief of Police in Seattle and for the Firefighters Union, which is, how do they feel about the use of public resources to allow a heavily armed SWAT team to raid nonviolent protesters inside of that building? Because in 1999, during the WTO protests, the mayor and city officials asked the police department at that time to use their fire hoses on demonstrators, and they refused. The firefighters said that they were going to walk off the job because it invoked images of Birmingham, Alabama, and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, when police used fire hoses and attack dogs on the demonstrators. So at that time in 1999, the firefighters refused, saying, quote, "Our job is to protect lives, not to endanger lives." So I'm wondering why they have allowed the SWAT team, which is a paramilitary organization, to use their fire truck in order to conduct that raid. And I would be very interested in what the fire chief and the police union, and what the firefighters union has to say about that.
What about the media blackout? Can you explain why you feel your rights as a journalist were violated by police?
Well, first of all, that's a very sensitive issue for me personally, because I was arrested at the state capitol and am now banned by the Washington State Patrol from covering any of the events at the protests at the state capitol. So the fact that police pushed us a block away from the building so that we were unable to document anything that was going on and any of the police activity, I feel is another violation of freedom of speech and assembly, but also of freedom of the press, because I was unable to actually videotape or get close enough to see what was happening that night. And I'm really shocked about the media blackout that happened. There was only one cameraman there from any of the corporate news outlets. I was on the phone calling all of the 24-hour news services in Seattle. At the Seattle Times and our local Fox affiliate here, they just weren't answering the phone, so I thought that was highly unusual. I looked around me and I didn't see any other reporters except for one cameraman who left before the events were even over. And it's a shame that no one was able to capture really good footage of the SWAT team with their assault rifles using that ladder truck to get on top of the building, because that would have been very compelling footage. But unfortunately, the news media in Seattle didn't seem to be interested in the SWAT team raid on nonviolent protesters that night. So I'm very, very upset about that. And as a journalist, I resent the fact that I was pushed so far away from the event that I couldn't really document what was happening. And also, for more than 12 hours after that raid on the warehouse, there were only 2 reports anywhere in the media. And one was a report by a blogger who lives on Beacon Hill, who was the only person that I know of who was able to take a photograph of the fire truck because it left soon after I arrived. And there were also some photographs that were taken by Joshua Trujillo from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, but other than that, there was really no media coverage for over 12 hours after the event happened. So the fact that there was a media blackout, at that point is very, very disturbing to me, because that should have all been documented, and there would have been amazingly compelling video if any TV cameraman had been there at the time of the raid. But when I was calling all of the news tip lines, they just didn't seem to be that interested in what was happening that night.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of SWAT teams and what they're used for?
SWAT teams were originally developed from special forces of the police departments back in the 1960s and 1970s. And initially they were created to handle very volatile and dangerous situations like bank robberies, hostage situations, standoffs with, gunmen. Unfortunately, after the United States declared its war on drugs, the SWAT teams then expanded their role to enforcement of laws prohibiting the use of drugs. And now, in 2011, they're being used against peaceful protesters in the Occupy movement. On November 20th, a SWAT team was also used to clear University of California, Berkeley students out of Wheeler Hall at that college. And then here in Seattle, they were used to evict nonviolent demonstrators from a warehouse. I'd like to point out that none of those people were armed or dangerous. This was not criminal activity. This was civil disobedience by a group of nonviolent protesters in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, Martin Luther King Jr. There was absolutely no reason for them to use there was absolutely no reason for them to use a paramilitary force in order to evict those protesters. And I'd also like to point out that across the country there have been other occupations of buildings in Portland, in Santa Cruz, in Minneapolis, and in other places around the country, including New York City, where SWAT teams were not used and are not being used currently to clear those people out of the buildings. The most extreme example of what SWAT teams are doing in the United States happened in Tampa, Florida, when police SWAT teams actually showed complete with treads, and that was actually deployed near the park where Occupy Tampa folks were having their protests. So this is a militarization of the police forces in the United States that's been happening since at least the 1999 anti-WTO protests in Seattle, because we witnessed the use of riot gear, pepper spray, tear gas, concussion grenades, rubber bullets, and all sorts of other so-called less lethal weapons, which are actually potentially lethal. And ever since then, the further militarization of the police has continued. And I actually contributed to a report by the National Lawyers Guild about the militarization of police in the United States. I'd also like to say that around the world, we see two things happening and uprisings in countries all over the planet. One is the use of the police by the global elite to stop these protests, because it tends to be the stopgap between the people who actually make the decisions that are affecting people's daily lives and the protesters on the street. And then in some countries such as Egypt and Libya and other countries, it becomes the military that actually becomes the violent force used to suppress the people. In the United States right now, it is the local municipal police forces that are being used for that purpose. And it's completely against the Bill of Rights and our rights as citizens to peaceably assemble and express and exercise our freedom of speech and assembly.